Hey guys, welcome back to HOA Stories. Imagine your entire family being harassed for over a decade just because you would not repaint your mailbox. Now picture this homeowner association board member next door filing fake deeds to steal your house, destroying your entire family and showing up on your lawn with an AR-15. What would you do next? Let's dive right into the video. And the title XXL Mega Saga is titled HOA Neighbor Pulls AR-15 on Me Because I Refuse to Move Out of My House. So the house I'm going to be talking about in this story had been in my family for decades, long before the neighborhood became what it is today. Back then, it was just a quiet street with modest homes and friendly neighbors who borrowed sugar and helped each other move furniture. Now it is a carefully manicured suburban paradise where every blade of grass is measured and every mailbox meets strict aesthetic guidelines. I have lived in that house my entire life. After college, I moved back home to help care for my aging parents, and after they passed, I stayed because it was all I had left of them. The house itself is not much to look at compared to the gleaming McMansions that have sprouted up around it, but it is solid, well-maintained, and filled with 3 decades of memories that no amount of money could replace. My parents were good people, my dad worked as an electrician for the city, and my mom taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. They kept their property immaculate, never missed an HOA payment, and went out of their way to be good neighbors. They planted flower beds every spring, kept their lawn perfectly trimmed, and even volunteered for neighborhood cleanup days. By any reasonable standard, they were model residents, but reasonable standards don't apply when you are dealing with someone who sees your very existence as a personal affront. The neighbor moved in next door about 10 years ago, right around the time the HOA was being restructured and expanded. He was in his early 50s then, recently divorced with thinning hair and the kind of aggressive ambition that comes from finally having something to control after losing control of everything else in his life. Within 6 months of moving in, he had managed to get himself elected to the HOA board. Within a year, he was essentially running it. The harassment started small, the way these things always do, a polite knock on the door one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, pointing out that our mailbox was slightly off standard, according to the new community guidelines. My dad, ever the peacemaker, apologized and spent his weekend repainting it to match the approved color scheme. The neighbor smiled and thanked him for being so cooperative. Well, 2 weeks later, he was back. This time it was the garden hose, which was apparently visible from the street and therefore in violation of these aesthetic cleanliness standards. My mom moved it behind the house that same day, and the neighbor made a note on his clipboard and left without a word of thanks. The complaints kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last one. Our doormat was the wrong shade of brown, the numbers on our house were too large. The tree in our front yard cast a shadow on his driveway, which somehow constituted a negative impact on neighboring property values. Every violation came with a formal letter on a HOA letterhead, though looking back now, I realize he was probably writing most of these himself and just using the board's authority to make them official. My parents complied with every single request, no matter how absurd. They were from a generation that believed in following rules and getting along with neighbors, even when those neighbors were clearly unreasonable. But their compliance only seemed to encourage him. Like a shark that smells blood in the water, he kept circling, looking for new things to complain about. The turning point came in year 3 of his campaign. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and I was visiting for the weekend when he showed up at our door with his usual clipboard and that thin, satisfied smile he wore whenever he thought he had found something particularly clever to torment us with. "I need to discuss some property maintenance concerns," he announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "The paint on your house is showing wear patterns that don't meet our community standards." My dad looked confused. "We had painted the house just 2 years earlier and it still looked perfectly fine. I'm not sure what you mean. What specifically needs to be addressed?" The neighbor walked over to our front door and pointed to a tiny spot where the paint had chipped near the doorknob. The chip was smaller than a dime. You would have to be actively looking for it to even notice that it existed. "This constitutes visible deterioration." According to the community guidelines, all exterior surfaces must be maintained to preserve neighborhood property values. My dad spent that entire weekend touching up paint around the house, fixing problems that were not really problems, trying to stay ahead of whatever microscopic flaw the neighbor might discover next. I watched him through the window and climbing up and down a ladder because some control freak had decided our family didn't belong in his perfect little kingdom. That is when I started paying closer attention to what was really happening here. The neighbor was not just enforcing HOA rules, he was weaponizing them. Every other house on the street had minor imperfections that were far more obvious than anything he had ever cited us for, but somehow those violations never made it onto his clipboard. The family across the street had been parking their RV in their driveway for months, which was explicitly prohibited by the HOA guidelines, but he walked past it every day without a second glance. It was only our house that received the white glove treatment. Only our family that got the surprise inspections and the threatening letters and the demands for immediate compliance with rules that seemed to be invented on the spot. I started keeping track of some of the complaints, though I was not as organized about it as I probably should have been. Every few weeks there would be another letter, another citation, another demand for compliance. The psychological toll on my parents was devastating. Dad, who had always taken pride in maintaining our property, became obsessed with perfection. He'd spend hours every day walking around the house looking for potential problems, fixing things that didn't need fixing, painting surfaces that were already pristine. Mom started avoiding the front yard entirely, afraid that her presence might somehow constitute a violation of community standards. They stopped hosting family barbecues because they were worried the neighbor might complain about the noise or the cars parked on the street. They cancelled their subscription to the daily newspaper because he had once cited them for allowing it to sit on the driveway for more than 2 hours after delivery. By year 5, the harassment had escalated beyond petty complaints about paint chips and garden hoses. He had somehow gained the authority to issue fines for violations, and he began using that power with increasing frequency and creativity. A dandelion in our lawn cost us $50. A package left on our doorstep for 3 hours resulted in a $100 fine for so-called unsightly storage of personal items. When our newspaper delivery was late one morning and arrived after 8 a.m., we received a citation for disruption of community aesthetics. The fines were always just small enough to be easier to pay than to fight, but they added up quickly. More importantly, they came with increasingly threatening language about potential legal action and property liens if we continued to be non-compliant residents. Every letter was a reminder that he held all the power and we existed in his neighborhood only at his sufferance. My parents aged years in months under the constant stress. My dad developed an ulcer and started having trouble sleeping. My mom's blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels and she had to start taking medication to manage her anxiety. I begged them to fight back to demand a full board vote on these citations, to hire a lawyer and challenge his authority. But they were terrified of making things worse. What if he finds a way to take the house? My mom would ask, her voice shaking. This is all we have. We cannot risk losing it. The neighbors seemed to sense their fear and fed on it. His complaints became more frequent and more aggressive. He started showing up at our door unannounced, demanding access to inspect our property for violations. He installed security cameras that were clearly positioned to monitor our yard and driveway. He began filing noise complaints for normal household activities, like running the dishwasher after 9 p.m. or starting the car before 7 a.m. The harassment continued for years, each one worse than the last. The fines became larger and more frequent, the complaints became more invasive and personal. He started questioning whether we were running a business out of our home because I received packages from online shopping. He suggested that our failure to maintain community standards was evidence of financial instability and that perhaps we should consider selling to someone more capable of meeting the neighborhood's expectations. By year 10, my parents were broken. The constant stress had taken a terrible toll on their health and their happiness. They stopped inviting friends over because they were embarrassed by the constant drama. They talked about selling the house and moving somewhere else, but they couldn't afford to lose money on a sale, and they were terrified that the neighbors' campaign of harassment had actually damaged their property value. They died within 6 months of each other in the winter of their 10th year. My dad's ulcer had developed into something more serious, and the stress had weakened his immune system to the point where he could not fight off a simple respiratory infection. My mom's heart gave out 3 months later. The doctors said it was congestive heart failure, but I knew better. She died of a broken heart, worn down by a decade of psychological torture that had stolen all the joy from her golden years. At their funeral, the neighbor did not even offer condolences. He did not send flowers or a sympathy card, he didn't acknowledge their passing in any way, but I saw him standing at his front window during the reception, watching the cars come and go, probably making mental notes about parking violations and noise ordinances. The grief hit my brother and me differently. I threw myself into handling the practical matters, funeral arrangements, insurance claims, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings. It was easier to stay busy than to sit still and feel the weight of everything we had lost. My brother took the opposite approach. He retreated into himself, spending days at a time in his childhood bedroom, emerging only for meals and the occasional walk around the neighborhood. We had inherited the house together, which felt both like a blessing and a curse. It was our childhood home filled with memories of better times, but it was also the battleground where our parents had fought their final losing war. The house was paid off, which meant we could afford to keep it even on our modest incomes. But keeping it meant staying in the line of fire, subjecting ourselves to the same harassment that had slowly killed our parents. For the first few weeks after the funeral, the neighbor left us alone. I thought maybe he had enough decency to allow us a brief mourning period, or perhaps he was simply planning his next move. I should have known better though. 3 weeks after we buried our mother, he knocked on our door. It was a Tuesday morning and I was getting ready for work when I heard his familiar pattern of sharp, impatient raps on the front door. My brother was still in bed, having been up most of the night, dealing with insomnia that had gotten worse since the funeral. I opened the door to find the neighbor standing there with his clipboard, but something was different. His usual thin smile was replaced by a cold, calculating expression. He looked past me into the house, as if he was evaluating it for purchase. "I wanted to discuss the future of the property," he said without preamble. "This is obviously a difficult time for you both, and I imagine maintaining this house will be challenging." "Well, we are managing just fine," I replied, not trusting myself to say more. "Of course, but realistically, 2 young people trying to maintain a property of this size, the upkeep costs alone must be overwhelming, and then there are the ongoing HOA obligations." The way he said it made my skin crawl. He had spent 10 years documenting our family's every move, and apparently that surveillance had extended to our financial situation. "I'm prepared to make you a reasonable offer for the property," he continued. "Cash sale, quick closing. You could both start fresh somewhere else, somewhere more suitable." I felt my brother appear behind me. He had heard voices and came downstairs to see what was happening. The neighbor's eyes flicked to him, taking in his rumpled appearance and hollow expression. "You could put all this behind you, move somewhere without all these associations, somewhere you wouldn't have to deal with community standards that might be challenging for people in your situation." What is that supposed to mean? My brother's voice was sharp, more alert than I'd heard him in weeks. "Young people, limited experience with property management. This neighborhood has certain expectations. I'm simply suggesting it might be easier if you found a community more suited to your circumstances." The audacity was breathtaking. He was standing on our doorstep 3 weeks after our parents' funeral, telling us we did not belong in our own childhood home. "How much?" I asked. His smile widened. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to me. The number was insultingly low, at least $40,000 below what the property was worth. "And that is generous considering the complications associated with the property. The history of violations, the maintenance issues, questions about whether the current occupants can even meet community standards." I looked at the paper, then at him, and then slowly tore it in half. "Get off our property." His smile disappeared instantly. "You're making a mistake, both of you. This neighborhood is not gonna get easier to live in. The standards are not getting lower, and I'm not going to get more tolerant of residents who cannot maintain the quality of life that everyone else expects." "Are you threatening us?" my brother asked. "I'm stating facts. This community has rules and those rules will be enforced. If you choose to stay, you'll be expected to comply just like everyone else. No special treatment, no grace period." He had made it clear that his campaign against our family was not over, it was escalating. Our parents' death had not satisfied him, it had emboldened him. "We cannot let him win," my brother said finally. "Mom and Dad would never forgive us if we just handed him the house." And well, over the next few weeks, the harassment resumed with a vengeance. Letters started arriving regularly, citing violations that ranged from ridiculous to completely fabricated, like our grass was allegedly too long, our garbage cans were supposedly visible from the street on non-collection days, a small crack in our driveway was classified as a so-called structural deterioration issue requiring immediate professional repair. Each violation came with increasingly large fines and more threatening language about legal action. My brother, who was already struggling with depression and anxiety, began to spiral. He had always been sensitive, but losing our parents and then being immediately thrust into this psychological warfare was more than he could handle. 2 months after our parents' funeral, something happened that changed everything. My brother had been handling most of the mail and paperwork because it gave him something to focus on. On a Thursday morning in April, he burst into my bedroom at 6 a.m., his face pale and his hands shaking. He was holding an official-looking document. "You need to see this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This came from the county recorder's office." I took the document and tried to make sense of the legal language. It was some kind of property filing dated 3 days earlier. At first I thought it was related to our parents' estate. Then I saw the neighbor's name listed as the new property owner. "What is this?" I asked, though a cold dread was already settling in my stomach. "It's a quitclaim deed." He filed paperwork claiming that Mom and Dad agreed to transfer the house to him before they died. He is saying they owed him money and signed over the property as payment. According to the filing, our parents had supposedly entered into a private agreement with the neighbor 2 years earlier, acknowledging that their persistent property maintenance violations and associated fines had damaged his property value. In lieu of monetary compensation, they had allegedly agreed to transfer ownership of our house to him upon their death. It was complete fiction. Our parents had never signed any such agreement, never owed him money, never had any business relationship with him beyond his role as HOA enforcer. But the document looked official, complete with what appeared to be notarized signatures and legal language. "This is fraud," I said. "Complete blatant fraud." My brother nodded, but his expression was becoming more agitated by the minute. "But what if people believe it? What if the county thinks it is real? What if we cannot prove it is fake?" I could see my brother spiraling into panic, his anxiety feeding on itself and growing stronger with each terrifying possibility. The neighbor had found our weakest point, our fear of losing the house, the last tangible connection to our parents. My brother spent the rest of that day researching property laws and quitclaim deeds, trying to understand what we were up against. What he found was not encouraging. Even when fraud was suspected, the legal process could take months or years to resolve. "He's been planning this," my brother said that evening, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "This whole time while he was harassing Mom and Dad, he was working towards this. He wanted them to die so he could steal the house." That night, my brother did not sleep at all. I could hear him pacing in his room, occasionally muttering to himself. By morning, he was manic with exhaustion and stress, talking rapidly about lawsuits and fraud investigations and the various ways we might be able to prove the neighbor's deception. But underneath his frantic energy, I could see the despair growing, the same despair that had consumed our parents during their final years. The feeling of being hunted, of having nowhere to turn, of being systematically destroyed by someone who held all the power. Over the next few weeks, my brother threw himself into fighting the fraudulent deed with obsessive intensity. He spent hours on the phone with lawyers and county clerks trying to build a case that would expose the neighbor's fraud. The stress was destroying him. He lost weight, developed a persistent cough, and started having panic attacks whenever the phone rang or mail arrived. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in May, exactly 3 months after our parents' funeral. My brother had been on the phone with a property attorney discussing the case. The lawyer had been cautiously optimistic about our chances, but had warned that the legal process could be lengthy and expensive. After he hung up, my brother sat at the table where our parents had once struggled with violation HOA letters. He looked exhausted, defeated. "I cannot do this," he said quietly. "I cannot live like this, never knowing if we are gonna lose everything. I cannot spend the rest of my life fighting him. We are going to win," I said, though I was not sure that I believed myself. Even if we win this time, there will be something else. There's always something else with him. He's never gonna stop. He's going to keep coming at us until we break, just like mom and dad. He went to bed early that night, claiming he was exhausted. I should have recognized the warning signs, the sudden calmness after weeks of manic energy, the way he hugged me goodnight like he was saying goodbye, the peaceful expression on his face after months of constant anxiety. I found him the next morning in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by family photos and the legal documents he had been studying for weeks. He had left a note apologizing for not being strong enough to keep fighting, for leaving me alone to deal with the neighbor's harassment. He wrote that he could not bear the thought of losing the house, but he also couldn't bear the thought of spending the rest of his life defending it. The neighbor had claimed another victim. My brother had not died of a heart attack or stress-related illness like our parents, but he had been killed just as surely by the relentless psychological warfare that had consumed our family for over a decade. I was alone now, the last member of my family, the sole heir to a house that had become both a blessing and a curse. And by the way guys, just to quickly interject in the story here, I know this is a really heavy story, but I would love to hear your opinion. Do you also like stories that are this serious? Usually I avoid stories like this, but I would love to hear your opinion because I thought this story is super interesting and it is too good to not read it. Because trust me, the ending of this story is absolutely incredible. Also, let me know in the comments where you are currently watching from. So anyway, the neighbor had won again, removing another obstacle between himself and his ultimate goal of seizing our property. But this time, his victory had come at a cost that even he might have not anticipated. I was no longer the grieving young person who had been intimidated by his threats and manipulation. I now was someone who had lost everything that mattered, someone who had watched my entire family be systematically destroyed by a predator who fed on other people's suffering. I had nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect except the memory of the people who had raised me in this house. The funeral home was the same one we had used for our parents just months earlier. Sitting in the same viewing room, making the same impossible decisions about flowers and music and burial plots felt like being trapped in a nightmare that kept repeating itself. The neighbor didn't attend my brother's funeral either, but I saw him in his front yard during the procession, working on his lawn as the hearse drove past our house. After I buried my brother, I sat alone where my family had shared thousands of meals, where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where my parents had spent their final years agonizing over HOA violation letters. The silence was deafening. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone in the house that had always been filled with voices and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life. A few days after the funeral, the elderly woman who lived across the street knocked on my door. I'd seen her around the neighborhood for years, but had never really spoken to her beyond polite waves and small talk about the weather. "I wanted to offer my condolences," she said when I opened the door. "Your family, they were very good people. What happened to them was not right." Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. "What do you mean?" She glanced towards the neighbor's house and then back at me. "May I come in? There are things you should know." We sat in my living room and she told me something I'd never heard about before. The neighbor's harassment campaign had not been limited to my family. Over the years, he had targeted a few other households in the neighborhood, always choosing people he perceived as vulnerable or different. "He drove the Garcia family away about 4 years ago," she said quietly. "They were elderly, lived alone, and sometimes forgot to bring in their trash cans. He made their lives so miserable that they sold their house and moved in with their daughter. Why didn't anyone stop him? Well, because most people didn't want to get involved. He was clever about it, never targeting enough people at once to create organized opposition. And he used his position on the HOA board to make everything seem official. What about you? Did he ever come after you?" Her expression darkened. "About 5 years ago, he decided my garden shed was an eyesore and he fined me repeatedly and threatened legal action. I ended up paying his fines and keeping my head down until he found a new target." She looked ashamed as she said it. "I'm sorry, I should have spoken up, should have tried to help, but I was scared. I'm just an old woman living alone on a fixed income. I could not afford to fight him. Would you be willing to talk about what you have seen?" I asked. "If it came to a legal battle?" She nodded slowly. "I think it's time someone stood up to him." That conversation gave me something I had not had in months: hope. Maybe I could find a way to fight back. And by the way, Ripe Stars, if you would be confronted with this awful situation, what would you do in order to fight back against this terrible neighbor? Let me know in the comments, I would love to hear your ideas and opinions. Anyway, I also knew that good intentions would not be enough. I needed professional help. The property lawyer I found had experience with HOA disputes and real estate fraud. Her office was cluttered with case files, and she looked like she had seen every possible variation of neighbor disputes and property scams. Fraudulent quitclaim deeds are not uncommon, she told me after reviewing the documentation. The signatures don't appear to match your parents' handwriting, by the way, and there are several red flags in the legal language. But proving fraud and getting the deed expunged are different things. She explained the legal process: filing a complaint with the county recorder's office, gathering evidence to demonstrate the fraudulent nature of the claim, and ultimately pursuing charges against the neighbor for filing false documents. It's gonna be expensive and time-consuming, she warned me. Your neighbor is clearly not gonna go down without a fight. She gave me an estimate that made my heart sink. Even with my savings and the small life insurance policies my parents had left, I'd be pushing the limits of what I could afford. There's another option, she said. We could pursue a restraining order based on the pattern of harassment. If we can demonstrate that his behavior constitutes stalking or intimidation, we might be able to get a court order that prohibits him from even contacting you. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a plan. It would not be easy, and it wouldn't be cheap, but it was something concrete that I could do to fight back. The legal process moved slowly. We filed the paperwork, but it took weeks just to get initial hearings scheduled. The county recorder's office was backlogged, and investigating the fraudulent deed required coordinating with multiple departments. Meanwhile, the harassment continued with renewed intensity. The neighbor seemed to sense that I was fighting back, and his complaints became more frequent and aggressive. Citations appeared on my door almost weekly. My mailbox was allegedly positioned incorrectly. My driveway showed signs of deterioration. The color of my trash bins did not match approved standards, but this time it was different. Instead of scrambling to fix these supposed problems like my parents had done, I just started documenting everything. I took photos of the alleged violations alongside identical conditions at other houses that were not being cited. I saved every letter, every citation, every threatening communication. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. The county finally agreed to investigate the fraudulent deed claim, but the process was frustratingly slow. Handwriting analysis took weeks to arrange and complete. The restraining order hearing kept getting postponed due to court scheduling conflicts. Meanwhile, I heard from a couple of other people who had had their own experience with the neighbor's harassment, though most were reluctant to get involved in an ongoing legal case. The single mom who had been driven out 3 years earlier was willing to provide a written statement about her experiences, but she had moved to another state and couldn't afford to come back for the court hearings. By fall, I was emotionally and financially exhausted. The legal bills were mounting, and the case seemed to be moving at a glacial pace. I was starting to understand why many of the neighbor's previous victims had simply given up and moved away rather than fighting back. Then in November, things finally started moving. The handwriting analysis came back conclusively showing the signatures on the quitclaim deed were forgeries. The county recorder's office agreed to expunge the fraudulent deed from the public record, and my lawyer felt confident that we could pursue criminal charges here. The restraining order hearing was finally scheduled for December. My lawyer was optimistic, but she warned me that even if we won, it would only be the beginning. Criminal proceedings could take months or years to resolve. The day before the hearing, I was reviewing my testimony when my lawyer called with news from the county recorder's office. So the fraudulent deed was being officially expunged, and a corrected title showing my sole ownership of the property would be filed within 24 hours. That afternoon, I was sitting in my living room when I saw the neighbor storm out of his house. Even from a distance, I could see that he was agitated, pacing back and forth on his front lawn while talking on his phone. When he hung up, he stood staring at my house for several long minutes with an expression I'd never seen before. It was not the smug satisfaction I'd grown accustomed to over the years, it was pure, unfiltered rage. He had just learned that his fraudulent deed had been expunged and that criminal charges were likely to follow him. Tomorrow's restraining order hearing would probably result in a court order prohibiting him from any further contact with me or my property. The court hearing the next morning went better than expected. The judge reviewed the evidence of harassment, listened to testimony about the pattern of selective enforcement, and granted me a temporary restraining order. The neighbor was now prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly, from entering my property, and from issuing any further HOA citations against my address without documented justification. This appears to be a clear case of abuse of authority and targeted harassment, the judge said. The defendant's pattern of behavior has been excessive and vindictive. My lawyer was pleased as we left the courthouse. Well, that went well. With the restraining order in place and the criminal fraud charges moving forward, he is essentially powerless to continue harassing you. I should have felt triumphant. After everything my family had endured, justice was finally being served. But as we drove back towards the neighborhood, I felt a growing sense of unease. The neighbor had spent over a decade believing that he was untouchable. That kind of entitlement and rage does not just disappear because a judge signs a piece of paper. When I pulled into my driveway that afternoon, I noticed his car was gone. His house looked empty, with the curtains drawn and no signs of activity. For a moment I wondered if he had actually left town, unable to face the humiliation of his public defeat and impending criminal charges. But I was wrong. That evening, I came home from dinner with my lawyer to find him waiting for me. His car was parked in his driveway, but he was standing on my front lawn, clearly agitated and pacing back and forth. When he saw me pull up, he started walking towards my car. I immediately called 911 from inside my vehicle, explaining that the subject of a restraining order was on my property in violation of the court order. The dispatcher told me to stay in my car with the doors locked and keep the line open while officers were dispatched. The neighbor reached my car and started pounding on the driver's side window, his face contorted with rage. I'd never seen him lose control like this before. For 10 years, he had been cold and calculating, methodical in his harassment, but now he looked completely unhinged. "You think you're so smart," he screamed. "You think you can ruin my life and get away with it?" I kept the dispatcher on the line, describing what was happening while trying to back out of the driveway. But he moved behind my car, blocking my escape route. 10 years I've been trying to improve this neighborhood. 10 years of dealing with your family, bringing down property values. And now you think some judge is gonna protect you? He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but after he hung up, his demeanor changed. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, staring at my house with an expression that made my blood run cold. "I tried to do this the civilized way," he said, his voice now eerily calm. "I tried to give you opportunities to leave voluntarily, but you just couldn't take the hint." He walked back towards his house, and for a moment I thought the crisis was over. Then he disappeared inside and emerged a few minutes later, carrying something that made my heart stop. It was a rifle, and he aimed it right at me. "Oh God," I whispered into the phone. "He has a gun. He's got a rifle. It looks like an AR-15. The dispatcher's voice became urgent. "I need you to get inside your house immediately and lock all the doors. Do not try to drive away. Officers are 2 minutes out." I abandoned my car in the driveway and ran for my front door, fumbling with my keys while the neighbor walked back towards my house with the rifle. I managed to get inside and lock the door just as he reached my front lawn. "You wanna use lawyers against me?" he shouted from outside. "You wanna destroy everything I've worked for? Let's see how tough you are now." Through the 911 call, the dispatcher could hear him clearly as he positioned himself on my lawn. "You have 30 seconds to come out here and get in your car, or things are gonna get very bad for you. I'm done playing games." I crouched behind my couch, still on the phone with 911, as the neighbor continued ranting about property values and community standards and his right to protect his investment. The dispatcher kept me on the line, assuring me that multiple units were responding to this. When the police cars arrived, lights flashing and sirens wailing, they found him standing on my front lawn, holding the rifle while screaming threats that were being recorded by the 911 dispatcher. The officers took cover behind their vehicles and ordered him to drop the weapon. For a moment he seemed confused, as if he couldn't understand why his authority was being questioned. He actually tried to argue with the police, insisting that he was handling a community problem and that they should be supporting his efforts to maintain neighborhood standards. "I'm on the HOA board," he shouted at the officers. "I have authority here. This person is a threat to our community." When they continued to order him to drop the rifle, his confusion turned back to rage. He refused to comply, instead pointing the weapon towards the police officers while continuing to rant about property values and his rights as a community leader. That is when one of the officers deployed a taser. The neighbor collapsed immediately, the rifle falling to the ground as electricity coursed through his body. Within seconds, he was swarmed by officers, handcuffed and arrested. I watched the entire scene through my front window, still on the phone with the 911 dispatcher. The man who had tormented my family for over a decade was lying face down on the lawn he had been so obsessed with protecting, completely powerless for the first time since this nightmare began. The neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening, drawn by the police sirens and flashing lights. They watched in stunned silence as the man who had terrorized several families was loaded into the back of a patrol car, still talking about community standards even as he was being arrested. The aftermath moved more quickly than the civil case had. The neighbor was charged with multiple felonies, assault with a deadly weapon, making terroristic threats, stalking, and violation of a restraining order. Combined with the earlier fraud charges related to the fake deed, he was looking at serious prison time. His lawyer tried to argue that he had been acting in defense of community property values, that his behavior had been legitimate enforcement of HOA regulations that had gotten out of hand due to stress. But the evidence was overwhelming. Recorded 911 calls, police testimony, witness statements, and a clear pattern of escalating criminal behavior. The criminal trial took almost a year to work its way through the system. There were plea deal negotiations, psychiatric evaluations, and various legal motions that dragged the process out much longer than I had expected. But eventually, he was convicted on most of the charges and sentenced to 6 years in state prison with additional civil penalties for the property fraud. His conviction had a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. A few other residents who had been intimidated into silence finally came forward with their own stories of harassment. The HOA board was restructured with new bylaws designed to prevent any single person from wielding unchecked authority. The house that had been a battleground for over a decade finally became peaceful again. I planted a garden in the front yard, the same spot where my mom used to grow flowers, before the neighbor's harassment made her too afraid to spend time outside. It felt like reclaiming not just the physical space, but the memory of happier times. Sometimes now I sit on the front porch in the evening watching the sunset and listening to the normal sounds of a neighborhood where people can live without being afraid of arbitrary citations and vindictive fines. The elderly woman across the street waves when she sees me, no longer worried about attracting unwanted attention. My parents and brother did not live to see justice served, but their memory is finally at peace. The house they loved is safe, and the predator who destroyed so many lives has been stripped of all power to hurt anyone else. It took 3 years from the time I first fought back until the day he was finally sentenced to prison. 3 years of legal battles, court hearings, depositions, and seemingly endless paperwork. 3 years of living with the uncertainty of whether justice would actually be served or if he had somehow found a way to escape consequences like he had for so many years before. In the end, his own uncontrollable rage was what brought him down. All the careful documentation, all the legal maneuvering, all the legal proceedings might not have been enough on their own. What sealed his fate was standing on my lawn with a rifle, making death threats that were recorded by 911 dispatch, witnessed by police officers, and impossible to explain away or minimize. The neighbor had been right about one thing: this neighborhood did have standards. Standards of basic human decency that he had violated for over a decade. He had spent 10 years believing he was untouchable, that his position gave him the right to play God with other people's lives, but bullies always make the same mistake. They assume their victims will remain victims forever. They never consider that someday someone might fight back with the same relentless determination they've used to cause suffering. And now a user in the comments wrote, "OP did everything right, documented everything, followed legal procedures, and didn't resort to vigilante justice." The neighbor brought this on himself when he escalated to armed threats. Comment number 2, I'm not excusing the gun incident, but OP admits their family violated HOA rules repeatedly. In my opinion, the neighbor was just doing his job. This whole post reads like a one-sided sob story designed to make the HOA look bad. Comment number 3, finally someone who fought back properly. Too many people just roll over when faced with HOA bullies. Your parents would be proud that you did not let him steal their house. Update to the story: it's been 3 years since the criminal trial ended, and people kept asking me what life is like now. Well, the honest answer is complicated. The relief I expected after his sentencing never really came. Instead, I felt weirdly hollow, like I'd been holding my breath for so long that I forgot how to breathe normally. My therapist says it's common for people who have lived in crisis mode to struggle when the crisis ends, but knowing that doesn't make it easier. The legal aftermath dragged on for another 18 months. There were appeals to deal with, civil proceedings that moved at a snail's pace, and endless paperwork from the HOA restructuring. My lawyer kept assuring me that everything was routine, but routine does not feel routine when you're still paying legal bills and getting calls about depositions and settlement conferences. His attorney did reach out about a settlement, but it was not the dramatic confrontation I might have imagined. Just a phone call with an offer that would cover my legal fees plus about $30,000 for pain and suffering. My lawyer thought it was reasonable, and honestly, I was tired of fighting. The money helped pay off the credit cards I had maxed out during the worst of it. The house feels different now, but not in the triumphant way I expected. Some days it feels peaceful, other days it feels too quiet, like I am waiting for something terrible to happen. I have made some improvements, painted a few rooms, fixed the leaky bathroom faucet that my dad never got around to, but it is slow going. Turns out grief and trauma don't just disappear because the bad guy goes to prison. My brother's room is still mostly his room. I moved some of my work stuff in there after about a year, but I kept most of his belongings. I'm not ready to pack them away just yet, and I might never be. That is something I'm learning to be okay with though. The new neighbors who bought this house are nice enough. They are a young couple, no kids yet, both work in tech. They nod when they see me, help with my garbage cans when I'm out of town, the kind of basic neighborly stuff that feels revolutionary after years of warfare. But we're not best friends or anything. I think I'm still learning how to trust that normal interactions will stay normal. The HOA board was restructured, which helped, but it's not like they completely reinvented how things work. There are more checks and balances now. Multiple people have to sign off on enforcement actions, and there's an appeals process. It's better, but it is still an HOA. I went to a few meetings the first year, mostly to make sure no one was trying to sweep everything under the rug, but I don't go regularly anymore. Mrs. Tremblay, the woman across the street, still waves when she sees me. We have talked a few times about what happened, and she has mentioned feeling bad about not speaking up earlier. I don't blame her. I understand why people were afraid to get involved, but I also don't pretend that we are suddenly close friends because we both survived living near a psychopath. Work is work. I'm still at the same job, still doing the same things. Some of my coworkers know bits and pieces of what happened, but it's not something I talk about much. I'm probably a little more direct than I used to be when something bothers me, but I wouldn't call it a personality transformation. I'm still basically the same person, just tired in different ways. The criminal case is closed, but he is still in prison for a few more years. Sometimes I wonder what will happen when he gets out, whether he'll try to move back to the area, or if the restraining order will actually mean anything. My lawyer says not to worry about it, that by then enough time will have passed that he'll probably just want to start over somewhere else. Maybe that is true, but I have backup plans anyway. I kept detailed records throughout this whole experience, partly because my lawyer told me to, and partly because writing things down helped me feel like I had some kind of control. I thought about turning it into a book or a blog or something, but I'm not sure. I want to relive it all by turning it into a project. Maybe someday. Right now I'm just trying to figure out what normal life looks like. By the way, the house is paid off, I have a steady job, and no one is threatening to fine me for having the wrong color mailbox. By most measures, I won. But winning doesn't feel like I thought it would. It mostly just feels like I survived something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. 3 people in my family died during this whole ordeal. A lawsuit and a prison sentence don't bring them back or erase the years of stress and fear. Justice was served, I suppose, but justice does not actually fix anything. It just stops the immediate problem and hopefully prevents it from happening to someone else. I still live in the same house on the same street in the same neighborhood. Most days that feels like a victory, and some days it just feels like stubbornness. Either way though, I'm still here and he is not, and that has to be enough. And now we get a 10-year update to the story, and by the way, if you have watched until here, you're the absolute GOAT, aka the greatest of all time, so please don't forget to post some star emojis in the comments to show me that you are an epic listener. Thank you so much. Anyway, I'm writing this from the same kitchen table where my family once agonized over HOA violation letters, but everything else has changed. Julia moved in 3 years ago after we had been dating for about 18 months. She knew the whole story before she agreed to even visit the house, I'd learned that radical honesty up front saves everyone a lot of trouble later. She listened to everything, asked thoughtful questions, and then said that she thought it was a beautiful house with good bones and terrible previous associations that didn't define it. Our daughter Isabella is 2 now, and she loves the front yard where my mom's flower garden used to be. Julia replanted it when we got engaged, using some of the original bulbs that had somehow survived years of neglect. Isabella picks dandelions and brings them inside like they are roses, completely unaware that those same weeds once cost my family $50 fines. We are expecting our second child in November, and Julia jokes that we are going to need a bigger house soon, but I'm not ready to leave yet. Maybe someday when the kids are older and need more space, but for now, this house is finally what it was always supposed to be, a home where a family lives and grows and makes noise without apologizing for existing. By the way, he was released on parole a few years ago. I found out through a victim notification system that sends updates about his status. According to the records, he moved to a city about 3 hours away and works at a hardware store. The restraining order is still active and he's prohibited from contacting me or entering this county. I don't think about him much anymore, which feels like its own kind of victory. The neighborhood is different now, several houses have turned over, and the new residents are mostly young families like us. The current HOA board operates more like a neighborhood association than a governing body. They organize block parties and coordinate snow removal, the kind of stuff HOAs are supposed to do. Mrs. Tremblay is still across the street, now 86, and delighted to have small children in the neighborhood again. I converted my brother's room into a nursery when Isabella was born. It took me years to be ready for that, but Julia was patient and never pushed. We kept some of his books on the shelves, and I like to think he would have been a great uncle. The house is full of life again, toys in the living room, fingerprints on the windows, the comfortable chaos of a family that belongs somewhere. Sometimes I catch myself doing the same things my parents did, reading bedtime stories, teaching Isabella to ride her tricycle in the driveway, planting vegetables in the backyard. We are building the life my parents always wanted us to have in this house, and that feels like the most complete victory of all. And yeah guys, it has been an honor to have you listening. Thank you so much, and I will see you again tomorrow.